Hi folks, it's Thinking Slow. We wanted to do a video about net zero and the cost of net zero and what it means for you. And more importantly, or as importantly, is to ask the question about what kind of structure of society we're heading into, because net zero and actually other government actions are creating a very significant top-down managed world for ordinary people who then lose a significant amount of autonomy. And I wanted to explain in this how much autonomy you could potentially lose by having net zero 2050 imposed on society as a target. So let's get started. The main cost for net zero to 2050 is 1.4 trillion pounds, which is up here, 1,390,000,000,000 pounds for 2020 to 2050. And that is a sum of all the capex that's going to be needed to achieve this net zero by 2050. That's over and above, if the business as usual scenario where we don't change anything in order to meet net zero, that's how much you'd have to spend, 1.4 trillion. And that works at about £50,000 per household in the UK. There's a couple of caveats there in that this number can be reduced through lower operating costs, and there's ways to finance it. So there are other numbers in the sixth carbon budget, but that is basically the headline number, and I'll break that number down by sector on the next page. I think one thing that occurred also to us is that a large part of that capex is going into replacing the power grid, and if you really think about it, the net utility to you as a user will basically be nothing from replacing the power grid, because electricity is electricity is electricity. And actually, the post investment with the new renewables will actually give you a worse grid, in the sense that you're replacing reliable electricity that's available on off any time with intermittent power generation. So this will be the first, I think, possibly ever, maybe large scale capital expenditure that generates no sort of tangible benefit for the consumer. There's obviously an environmental benefit, and it's really a question of what value do you place on that. But actually, in terms of consumption, you won't see any difference. So an awful lot of pension money is going to be tied up in delivering something that doesn't give the consumer any additional benefit apart from the environmental. And again, there's a question on how you value that. Another big question has been on cars. So is the idea that you don't drive, that you basically will lose cars. There won't be replacement of internal combustion engine cars with EV cars. And there it's a little bit not 100% clear what's in the budget. So the position now is basically 32.7 million cars on the road in the UK, and then that will, in the carbon budget, there's talk of 28 million cars by 2035 of electric vehicles, potentially that's sort of 4.7 million cars off the road, but it's not 100% clear whether it's still assuming there are some additional cars still on the road in 2035. So it's probably not fair to say there's a huge cutback in vehicles, but there's certainly, in theory at least, 4.7 million cars gone here. And then in the footnotes to the carbon budget, it talks a lot about bringing forward the day of stopping internal combustion engine sales. So that's currently 2030 is the plan, but I think there's various options for moving that around. So I think, if anything, this number may go down basically, and they may try and completely ban internal combustion engines slightly earlier, because this is the way the policy planning goes. It's very lopsided, which is one of the issues we want to talk about now. Now, the other thing that really sort of bothers us about this is, this is now nudging on steroids in this sixth carbon budget. And you'll see in a lot of the sectors talk about limiting demand. And then you get into your behavioral psychology and nudging. And there's a lot of talk about changing behavior, especially in terms of your diet, in terms of meat and dairy products. And that's one thing we'll look into briefly on this film. And actually, we will do other films where we'll take a deeper dive into agriculture and cars, but this is just to give you the headline position right now. Now, looking at the whole sixth carbon budget, all in all, I would say it's somewhere about 900 pages plus endless pages of spreadsheets. This is now pure technocracy. This is a top-down plan that regulates every single sector. It regulates all your consumption behavior. Probably it's much more detailed than Soviet planning under Gosplan. So this top-down plan literally regulates everything. There's assumptions about how often you travel, where you travel, how many children you have, what you eat, how much dairy you have. I mean, this is the way technocracy works. A sort of elite at the top decide what needs to be done, and then they put in all these targets and then start tracking it. That is basically technocracy, and it's obviously a complete reversal of what the West has always been about, which is sort of individual choice, liberty, private enterprise. This is not that. This is top-down government mandating of targets, basically, which then go and drive everything else. So I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but this is the breakdown from the 1.4 trillion, and this is taken from the FT, so you get a feeling that the number is not made up. This is directly from the sixth carbon budget spreadsheet, but you're spending about 50 billion a year in these years in order to invest in all these sectors. And as I said, we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into at least some of these on a separate video. Certainly for agriculture, we're going to look at more closely because there's obviously a question there about how much land they're intending to take out of food production. And that also is kind of slightly mind-boggling, but that's a separate topic. And as I said, they have another cost, which is an abatement cost, which is basically net of operating cost savings, and there's some assumptions on financing. But that's a number that's not intuitively obvious to get. This number is intuitively obvious that to achieve the 2050 net zero from a sort of steady state of business as usual, you need to be spending £50 billion a year. That's what this table is telling you. And okay, you can, that can be reduced through operating costs and whatever else, but that's the headline number. And that's, if you add this all up for 2020 to 2050, you get that 1.4 trillion figure in the introduction. So I'm just going to go back now and talk a little bit about what this really means from the point of view of government, because I think that's much, in a way, more important, or at least in some way, than the numbers. Because, as I've said, when you look at this, you're struck by the fact that we're now doing top-down state planning of every element of your life. And I put this up because we had it on another channel, just so you know that we did this already in 2020. We guessed that the lockdowns and the response to COVID wasn't really just about COVID. It was about a lot more, and it was about the Great Reset. And I think even then the term had just about been used a few times, but we came up with this diagram that basically your way of life essentially is going to be turned upside down, and the agenda items to be used to do that would be green, equality, racial justice. And that was in 2020, and here we are 2022, and you have the scenes in Canada and France. So I think it's not an overstatement to say we are basically in a revolution, and this net zero is part of that revolution, because again it requires essentially a totally centralized, top-down planned Soviet-style economy. So let's just go in a little bit into this some more. So, as I said, this is sort of revolutionary in the sense that you're wiping out essentially the sort of the traditional basis of Western democracy, the sort of individual responsibility, liberty, limited and responsive government. A lot of that stuff disappears, and certainly one thing for sure is our traditional Judeo-Christian ethics system is basically disappearing, or it's very much weaker than it was, and then inevitably, when that goes away, you're left with a sort of gap, and into that gap, in our view, have come in various kind of quasi-cult organizations, and like a lot of things, or like everything essentially. The climate lobby is obviously, it's a big spectrum of organizations, from fairly reasonable, moderate organizations through to completely extreme element of the climate agenda. And then this poster that was put up a couple of days ago, it's a picture of a lady breastfeeding a baby, and the writing on the poster is saying future or climate killer. And that's referring, I assume, to the baby. And having, if you can look at a small baby and even link that to the word climate killer, based on sort of too many people and population growth, I think it's a sick way of looking at humanity, to be honest, to do that. And I think this is sort of representative of some of these outlandish and extreme elements of the climate movement. It's very, I find this very disturbing, but you have to recognize that this the climate tent basically includes these kind of very radical points of view, and that's reality basically. I'm going to start now with what is the background to net zero, and we're going to go to 1972, to something called the Club of Rome, which sounds like a sort of holiday destination in Italy, but it isn't. It's a oligarch sort of club. It's one of several. I think now, as this whole Great Reset thing has been going on, everyone now has been looking more and more at these organizations. What are they? What do they do? So Club of Rome is just one of them, along with the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberg Group and several others, Atlantic Council, etc., etc. These are basically forums for closed-door meetings between, well, essentially, I think you could call them oligarchs, and government officials and heads of business. Most of what goes on there is, as I said, behind closed doors, so you don't really know what's going on. And I think it's a fair assumption to guess that the interests of ordinary folk are not well represented in those meetings, i.e. not represented at all. And therefore you end up with agenda items that are relevant to those groups, and maybe not so to the general population. So these are some forecasts that they produced in 1972 around the sort of future population, future pollution, future resource utilization, and one of the main assumptions of the group and the other groups as well is that these are global problems, and there's essentially no such thing as a global government. Therefore, we have to set ourselves up and deal with these global issues, and we can't afford to leave it to national governments. And of course, for all their faults, there is a democratic accountability to national governments, but there's essentially no democratic accountability to these global organizations. And nonetheless, they have essentially appointed themselves into these roles, and they've produced various kind of policy positions through those behind closed door meetings. And this is the modelling now from 1972 for the global population under different scenarios, and the exact numbers don't matter. This has been normalized. It doesn't matter what the exact numbers are, but look at it as a rate of growth. And these boxes here are basically what happens if we carefully manage everything. So consumption, how many children per family, etc., etc. You get this nice managed curve of population. Now, if you have a sort of laissez-faire, let people do what they want kind of approach, there's two outcomes. There's this one, which is a sort of business as usual, things carry on, and there's a high technology innovation scenario, which to some extent, I guess, unsurprisingly, allows greater populations. So you get more and more efficiencies, and you get more from less, basically, through the use of technology. And both of these, then, what happens is population collapses. In the business as usual, it's 2020, and this one, it's somewhere about 2050. And the collapse in population is based on, resources running out, excess pollution, etc., etc. So the important conclusion from here is this group, particularly the Club of Rome, and actually all of the sort of oligarch groups, essentially have decided that the growth of population will lead to a complete collapse of society stroke the planet. Therefore, that's an unacceptable outcome. And actually, one of the people that wrote this model had actually put a figure in an interview of the Earth can basically support about 2 billion people. So, that's a heck of a lot lower than where we are now, basically. But that's just one of that is a fact that quote exists. Now, the big part of this is I'm seeing a lot of parallels with COVID, because it's a tight group of people making these calls. The calls are based on opaque modeling. Who knows what's going on in this model. Actually, people have reviewed it, but I don't think there's been any real sort of open discussion about these assumptions and trade-offs and anything else that's going on here. Quite apart from the fact that this is wrong, of course. It sort of holds fairly well for population numbers, but the idea within the model that lots of resources will have run out by now is not true. And of course, a lot of the COVID modeling was also turned out to be completely wrong. And the other point about this is that if you start asking questions about this, you're immediately a flat earther, a denier, a anti-science, or whatever else they want to throw at you. But this is basically where there's a very clear picture that the sort of elite, I use the word in inverted commas, had decided that population cannot be left alone, and that there is a role for more or less regulating everything in order to avoid a societal collapse down the road. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that is their view of the world, that it needs to be managed top down, otherwise there'll be too many people taking too many resources and causing too much pollution. So that brings us nicely on to Davos today, which is sort of 50 years later, which is in a way you can read the same thinking there. The Great Reset, we've done another film on, which is on the channel if you'd like to see it, but that's very much focused on reducing consumption, regulating effectively the lives of people, and it talks about people working from home, not traveling, not going abroad, eating less meat. And then that Great Reset basically feeds almost exactly into the sixth carbon budget for the UK. It's the same language, same kind of thinking. It's very difficult to conclude that this is anything than a top-down, basically, from Davos. All this is translated into national policies, and for the UK it's a sixth carbon budget. And this is, I think the main point about this is, and this also appears everywhere all over the World Economic Forum material, that for them lockdown was an opportunity, and they want basically these changes in behavior, consumption to be permanent. And for them this is reducing demand, and this is therefore playing into their carbon budget because they need to get to net zero by 2050. So for them, and also for the World Economic Forum, lockdowns are a huge positive, and I'm still going to maintain, as I always did from 2020, that lockdowns were primarily about achieving this top-down management of society and very little to do with public health. And the more I read of this net zero agenda, the more I'm convinced that's the case. So just sort of finishing up a little bit with the idea of top-down, within the explanatory notes of the sixth carbon budget is this section on replacing meat. And I put this one in here because I think this is the most illustrative that this is not a bottom-up, this is not a people-driven process. So when they're talking about eating insects, they say that this is in some parts of the world, but unfortunately it's not in Western diets, and there's an opportunity to have this in Western diets. And again, there's a whole lot of this applied psychology discussion about behavioral change, and that's something we've also done quite a lot of work on with Professor Bagus and others. Sort of everything involves around applied psychology, where the government decides what's good for you and then applies unethical psychological manipulation to basically make you do what they want you to do. And I think this is the clearest indication in the document that this is so much top down. And if you think about it, this is a group of people essentially looking at us like a herd of farmyard animals and deciding what should we be fed on. The meat's no good because there's not enough, there's too much carbon there, so let's play around with these different options: lab-grown meat, insects. I mean, I find the whole thing pretty offensive, to be honest, that someone's deciding I need to eat insects. And just leaving this part, this is quite a common theme also a lot in the World Economic Forum material, that why can't the West be more Chinese, basically. And I've seen that in quite a few places, and I think this also plays into that a little bit. But again, this clearly shows this is not a traditional Western bottom-up popular movement. This is a top-down technocratic solution to problems they've identified. And here we get into a little bit of nitty-gritty, that the main person chairing this whole initiative is earning a very, well, I don't know exactly how much he's earning, but he's earning a lot of money through consultancy for complying with all these environmental regulations. So he is obviously completely conflicted, because the more stringent he is able to make the carbon budget through his position as chair of the Climate Change Committee, that the more stringent those requirements are, the more revenue potential there is for advising corporates and others on how to comply with those regulations. And I think this is part of the incipient corruption within the UK system. I'm just taking a screenshot here of one page. This actually goes on for pages and pages and pages. There's also a family business around advising on compliance with sustainability issues. So this to me is very bad. I mean, this shouldn't be happening. It's clearly a conflict, and I can't see how this wouldn't drive greater desire for more onerous regulation, basically. So this is not good, really. The next piece of the puzzle, which it takes quite a while to figure out, is that climate, for various reasons, has more or less always been viewed as a stick to bash industry with by far left. And the far left have always obviously wanted to destroy capitalism. It's more or less a stated objective. And this is from an MP in the UK, Zara Sultana, who's a very young member of parliament who's affiliated with the Corbyn sort of far left bloc. And this is slightly interesting because here it's very explicit. It's not often explicitly stated like this, the direct link between climate change and defeating capitalism. And so you have quite an unholy alliance, I think, pulling those different groups together, of the radical climate group that I described, the sort of oligarchy that seems to be very much into this issue without. And by the way, nobody on this video is denying climate change. What we're asking is a degree of balance in these policy objectives. So there's an oligarchy setting policy without reference to the sort of interests of ordinary folk, and then you have then the third element, which is this far left grouping, and there's always been essentially a union between environmental extremism and far left politics, and it's in black and white here. So this is quite a formidable array of forces pushing this agenda. And then we'll just sort of starting to wrap up a little bit here. You know, this is one of the main questions. So I put that 1.4 trillion figure up for the UK. The UK now is emitting about 300 million tons. So on this thing, we would be somewhere here, going to zero, sort of over here. Now, you know, there's an argument that everybody has to make their own contribution, and you can't just walk away because someone else isn't contributing. But I mean, look at the contribution of 300 million tons, which would be 0.3 billion, compared to the increases in output you're seeing in China, India, other places. I mean, it's not even a drop in the ocean. It's noise at the bottom of the line. And okay, in aggregate, it might add up with all kinds of other countries, but you have to again have a sense of perspective here that we will be shoving in gigantic amounts of pension savings into moving from 300 million down to nothing, and the scale is up to 35 billion. So this really has to be borne in mind when making all these sacrifices, because at the end of the day, the question is, what is the net impact? And looking at this, it won't be even noticeable. So again, I think as well as the nitty-gritty of the numbers that we'll get into in other videos, I think for us the important thing is now, you know, these are the messages we're bombarded with by the government, rather than things that we're asking the government to do. You know, net zero, everyone has to stay safe, and it's all about collective interests. And everything the government's been doing for years now, but especially with COVID, has been essentially coercion around those kind of objectives. And as that process goes on, they've been chipping away at individual rights, and in many ways denying the existence of those rights, and denying the role of the individual with their personal responsibility. And that's what vaccine mandates are all about. You know, you are no longer a person with the right to informed consent. You are part of the herd, and if we say you're going to be jabbed, you're going to be jabbed. And if you don't want to be jabbed, you'll lose your job. It's pretty clear. I mean, it's coercion of the worst sort, and this is what happens when you have these sayings about collective interests. What it basically means is your decision-making autonomy is taken, but it's passed somewhere else. It doesn't disappear. It ends up with bureaucrats, and they decide for you. And if you don't want to do that, you will be punished in some way. So in many ways, you're turning the structure of traditional Anglo-Saxon sort of Western society upside down, and you're bringing in all of those things that are a nightmare, have been a nightmare in other societies. So, you know, name the successful totalitarian society. Okay, China's managed to achieve above GDP growth for a long time. That's maybe, but generally, if you look over time, anything totalitarian collapses into a sort of nightmare. And we're importing all of that thinking and methodology into what used to be liberal societies based on certain ideas of ethics and individual liberty. So the question is, you know, how do you get out of that? And already in 2022, obviously a lot of activities going on in order to get out of this and stop this process. So one thing all of us have learned is, of course, to largely ignore mainstream media, and that, I have to say, was a shock to me, how twisted and dishonest a lot of that reporting is, and in fact anything important is ignored altogether. Having been fighting with journalists for a couple of years about twisted and warped articles about COVID, so I and many others don't listen to anything that comes out of there. And I think the mainstream parties, this is the big question for me, is they're so used to policy setting within those kind of elite again, clubs, Bilderberg, Davos, wherever. I think they're too far gone, most of those people, to remember that they're actually there for the benefit of the electorate and their constituents. I think it's totally pointless. Left, right, red, blue really makes no difference. So there's now this whole plethora of new parties, and that's probably the only way forward. The Reforms and Reclaims and the Alliance for Democracy and Freedom, they are sort of proper grassroots, bottom up, no corporate and no oligarch funding, and they actually represent people. Whether it's going to be possible for them to get enough traction to do something, who knows, but I think for me, many others, I think as well, party politics now is just it's just a sideshow. There's no real difference, and in fact it's only worse. So if you have some on the right who don't want big government, all the left are screaming for even bigger government. So it's there's not much to choose from in the mainstream. The other part is, and we will do some films on this, is the role of foundations in policy setting. I mean, our basic view is around about 15 oligarch-owned, run foundations basically set policy all around the world for most important things, and those policies then get rolled out by national politicians who are actually elected. And that's something it's probably true since the dawn of time, to be honest, but it's become now quite clear if the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission and the Club of Rome operated, quite quietly in the background somewhere that nobody knew about. All of a sudden, of course, the World Economic Forum is making a sort of similar role, but it's now out in the open and quite public. So people are really asking a lot of questions, and of course the head of the World Economic Forum is boasting about how many people he has in various national governments around the world, and I think that's going to get people's attention, and they're going to find that slightly irritating. So this is a big thing, the government's there to serve these oligarch interests, or are they there to serve the people? It's to some extent you need to do both, but people right now I think are more or less ignored in a lot of these policy developments. So this is a big question. Deep politicizing. I mean, I think we've seen that in COVID again, and certainly in the use of applied psychology. If you look at the political background of the people in those groups, they're far left academics, and a lot of academia tends leftwards, putting it mildly, and they have clearly been pursuing collectivization as a far left sort of idea, and that's to them. And I think the COVID crisis has been used to advance that agenda, and that shouldn't be happening. If they're a scientist to provide scientific advice on something, then that's what you should stick to. You shouldn't be grafting your political views onto public health and etc. etc. It's not just public health; it's essentially everything now, and there's quite a lot of work being done now to try and get this out. We don't want these sort of neo-Marxist theories being pushed through public health, public education, etc. 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 And then ultimately it's down to the people eventually. People complain about the government, but there's you may as well complain about the people, because it's really up to everyone to get involved in this stuff now, because otherwise it will just veer off onto its own trajectory unless people get involved in this stuff. And I can't say it's always fun. These documents of policies go on for hundreds of pages. And that's of course deliberate, because it's not interesting to plough through all of that language to work out what these people are up to. But that's a necessary evil at the moment, because I think if you leave the policy setting groups alone with the way they are now, you're going to end up with very unpleasant, coercive, top-down tyranny, essentially. So these are the steps that would be needed to avoid that happening. And as I said, ultimately it's down to people. You're going to put the smartphone away and roll up your sleeves and get involved in politics. That's the only way that this will change, really. And so far it's looking reasonably good, I think. There's been some very encouraging movements for liberty in the last certainly 6 months or so, but this has got a long way to run. So thank you very much. As I always say at the end, it's do not stay safe, but stay free, because if you don't have your freedom, you're not going to have your safety. So right now, that's the most important thing, is to stay free. And we'll be doing a number of videos about this net zero, because it is such a big topic. We're going to peel into that 1.4 trillion figure and show what it looks like net of savings. We're going to do a little bit of a walk through the agricultural sector, because I think everybody needs to know about how much land these people are intending to take out of food production, which is quite alarming. And we'll have a little bit closer look at transport as well. What are the scenarios for car ownership? So hopefully those things are coming up next. You'll find them interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Bye.